The Great Awakening, the rise of conspirituality. In the past 8 years, a narrative known as the Great Awakening has taken root, presenting itself as a collective spiritual ascension. The movement quickly gained traction within New Age circles and spiritual communities, as many seekers latched onto it as evidence of a global shift in consciousness. However, the origins of this movement were not spiritual. It did not emerge from deep introspection, self-inquiry, or authentic personal transformation. Instead, it arose from conspiracy narratives, political manipulation, and a reactionary response to global instability. It created a new category of ideology known as conspirituality, a new religion. During this period, the Great Awakening movement became intertwined with conspiracy theories, particularly those surrounding COVID-19 and mass vaccination, the belief that an elite-controlled oligarchy was using the pandemic to enforce population control, the satanic elite narrative, accusations that global leaders, billionaires, and institutions were engaged in child trafficking, ritual abuse, and demonic worship, the demonization of progressivism, a reactionary push against cultural and political shifts reframed as a battle of good versus evil. This movement capitalized on fears of vulnerable individuals, particularly those already disillusioned with institutions. Donald Trump and his allies deliberately mobilized this demographic, using psychological tactics to target specific audiences via social media. He hired a company called Cambridge Analytica prior to the 2016 election to identify an audience that could be easily manipulated. This company was quickly dissolved after the election was won. Troll farms allegedly sourced in Russia were used to infiltrate religious and spiritual groups, to spread misinformation and manipulate the communities by preying on a believer's tendency to emotional reaction instead of critical thinking, turning them against political opponents, societal minorities, and anyone who could be utilized to induce fear, anger, hatred, to be perceived as an enemy. A significant proportion of the demographic targeted by the rise of conspirituality comes from marginalized, economically disadvantaged, and socially stigmatized backgrounds. Many of these individuals have faced poverty, lack of education, and limited access to opportunities, leaving them feeling disenfranchised and unheard. The psychological effect of chronic instability, generational trauma, and systemic neglect create an environment where victim mentality becomes a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. These individuals are not just lacking material wealth, they have also been deprived of the critical thinking skills, self-worth, and psychological stability needed to break free from disempowering narratives. Historically, such groups have been easy prey for religious institutions, charismatic leaders, and ideological movements that offer them a sense of belonging, moral clarity, and purpose. When exposed to conspiratorial and pseudo-spiritual narratives, they become particularly susceptible, not necessarily because they are unintelligent, but because their distrust of authority, compounded with a desperate need for meaning, makes them seek refuge in belief systems that validate their suffering. These movements provide them with a sense of identity and community, often offering simplistic answers to complex systemic issues. Rather than addressing their internalized victimhood and disempowerment, they are encouraged to see themselves as warriors in a larger battle against unseen forces, whether that be the government, science, global elites, or even abstract spiritual enemies like satanic forces. This reinforces their mind traps, further entrenching them in a belief system that gives them comfort but ultimately keeps them disempowered. And it's not just contained to this demographic. As a movement like this takes hold and builds momentum, individuals from all classes, academia, and governance jump on board, whether the narrative supports their preconceived beliefs or if they simply succumb to a herd mentality. But as a movement like this is not based on solid foundation, it begins to consume itself and ultimately falls apart under its own corruption. How it started. Two key players stand out in the rise of the current Great Awakening conspiracy, though many other factors contributed to its development. This is not the first time in history that a Great Awakening has been proclaimed. From the mid-1700s to the early 20th century, various Great Awakenings emerged, each attempting to reshape society through moral absolutism, and all of them based in religious dogma. While these movements led to some positive reforms, such as the abolition of slavery and greater calls for equality, they ultimately failed because moral absolutism does not work in complex societies. Instead of addressing the root causes of social issues, they demonized the symptoms, leading to increased crime, social unrest, and forcing morality through law without understanding human behavior, leading to unintended consequences. This pattern has re-emerged in the digital age, where movements like QAnon and the cult of Kek have revived the same black and white moral narratives, but adapted them to the internet age, using mimetic warfare, online radicalization, and conspiracy rhetoric to spread their ideology. The cult of Kek emerged on the dark web forum 4chan in 2015, a notorious breeding ground for alt-right extremism, fascism, and bigotry. Originally, Kek was a slang term used as an alternative to LOL, but it soon took on a deeper symbolic meaning. Users discovered that Kek was also the name of an Egyptian frog god associated with chaos and darkness, which they ironically embraced as a representation of their movement. During Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, this frog god symbolism was fused with Trump's persona, portraying him as a chaotic savior destined to dismantle the establishment and usher in a resurgence of alt-right ideology. This online subculture developed a loosely organized occult-style psychological operation, using memes, digital propaganda, and absurdist humor to shape belief narratives and manipulate public discourse. The internet meme, Pepe the Frog, originally an innocent cartoon, was co-opted into this movement as a powerful sigil of mimetic magic, a concept rooted in the belief that repeated symbols and ideas can manifest reality. While the cult of Kek was a chaotic, decentralized internet movement, it laid the groundwork for an even more organized belief system, QAnon. In 2017, an anonymous figure known as Q appeared on 4chan, spinning an elaborate conspiracy narrative that co-opted the language of awakening, spiritual transformation, and divine battle, all in service of pushing a right-wing authoritarian agenda. What many fail to recognize is that this entire movement, Kek, QAnon, and Trumpism, was never a grassroots spiritual awakening. It was, and remains, a political and psychological power grab, disguised as divine revelation. In fact, it is the very epitome of false light, a deception masquerading as spiritual enlightenment. The greatest irony is that the very people claiming to fight against demonic forces are in practice using the exact same techniques that they denounce. A traditional Christian group would never engage in sigil work, meme magic, or occult symbolism, as they would consider such practices inherently demonic. And yet, this movement openly embraces these methods while weaponizing religious fear against their perceived enemies. This begs the question of who they really are. Ultimately, the cult of Kek, QAnon, and Trump are not a battle against darkness. They are an extension of it, using the very tools of manipulation they claim to be resisting. What went wrong? How did this happen? As of 2025, an alt-right authoritarian presence dominates America and the global geopolitical landscape. Many former Trump voters are experiencing disillusionment. The very policies they voted for, believing they would restore economic stability, traditional values, or freedom, are now directly harming them, leaving many regretting their decision. For those from the spiritual community that followed, believing that they were participating in a great spiritual awakening, what happened? How did so many get swept into a movement that promised liberation but delivered oppression? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of spirituality, consciousness, and the mechanisms of belief. The pre-trans fallacy and the danger of misinterpreted spirituality. At the heart of this phenomenon is the pre-trans fallacy, a concept developed by Ken Wilber. This fallacy occurs when pre-rational belief systems rooted in superstition, emotion, and blind faith are mistaken for trans-rational wisdom, that is, genuine spiritual insight that transcends and includes rationality. What this means is that people who have not yet developed critical thinking, scientific reasoning, or rational self-inquiry mistake their emotional reactions, gut feelings, and conspiracy-driven beliefs for higher spiritual insight. This is not a progress towards enlightenment, it's a regression. Spiritual awakening is not about clinging to external beliefs, but about dismantling one's conditioned mind and experiencing direct awareness beyond ideology. However, when belief-based individuals misunderstand metaphorical spiritual concepts, they project those symbols onto external enemies, repeating a pattern that religious institutions have used for centuries to maintain control. This critical confusion has allowed authoritarian figures, conspiracy movements, and manipulative leaders to hijack spirituality itself, turning what should be a path to freedom into a tool for oppression and control. It has slowly infiltrated into the New Age, plant medicine, personal development, and spiritual community. Esoteric truths versus exoteric corruptions. The irony of the Great Awakening movement is that everything it demonizes, esoteric teachings, ancient wisdom, occult traditions, are the foundation of its own religious roots. Ancient mystery schools, Hermeticism, and Platonic, Buddhist, Taoist, Vedantic traditions were centered on deep self-inquiry and the understanding of consciousness. The wisdom was later encoded into metaphorical spiritual texts, but misunderstood by later followers, leading to the formation of rigid dogma, misinterpretation, and power-seeking institutions. Religions were originally symbolic representations of deeper truths, but over time, people mistook the symbols for literal reality. That is to put it another way, that trying to describe an ineffable experience from outside reality using metaphors and analogies from within known reality are not meant to be interpreted literally. Rather than turning inward and getting to know the functions, processes, and mechanisms of their own mind, followers projected spiritual struggles outward onto demons, devils, and external enemies. Ironically, demons, devils, angels, and gods are all symbology for different facets and levels of the mind, consciousness, and awareness, not actual literal objective entities. This is exactly what we see happening today with conspiratorial narratives co-opting spirituality. The satanic elite narrative is a modern version of the medieval witch hunts. The global cabal is a recycled anti-Semitic trope from centuries past. The fight against woke ideology is a refusal to embrace an evolving, more nuanced worldview. The entire movement isn't about spiritual awakening. It's a desperate attempt by those stuck in lower stages of development to cling to an outdated worldview, because change, growth, and understanding threatens their very identity as a person. What we are seeing now is not a great awakening, but an egoic backlash against the natural progression of human consciousness. The world is evolving towards inclusivity, diversity, and a more fluid, interconnected understanding of reality. Those stuck in rigid belief structures and black and white thinking feel threatened by this shift. Their reaction? A violent fear-based resistance, misinterpreted as a spiritual battle. This is not about left versus right, science versus religion, or tradition versus progress. It's about awareness in contrast to unconscious reaction. The ascension is about going from unconscious conditioned reaction to conscious, aware, and thoughtful response. This requires stepping outside the confines of a conditioned mind and gaining some recognition and mastery over it. Those who refuse to examine their own beliefs and subconscious fears are ripe for manipulation. They become tools for political agendas, religious fundamentalism, and regressive ideologies, all while believing they are free thinkers and awakened souls. Nothing could be further from the truth, and the best way to spot them is their emotional reaction, particularly fear and anger. It's also not just about the pre-trans fallacy. While individuals exist at varying stages of cognitive, social, cultural, and spiritual development, there has also been a breakdown in how spiritual truths are taught and realized, including the reasons why people seek out spirituality in the first place. Are secret societies evil for hiding spiritual truths? Many assume that esoteric spiritual wisdom has been deliberately hidden out of elitism or control. However, the mystery schools safeguarded these teachings for a reason. Much like how medical students are not immediately allowed to practice without extensive training, you wouldn't let an unqualified individual perform surgery, and the same applies to higher spiritual knowledge. Not everyone is ready, nor does everyone have a genuine interest in understanding these truths beyond their own biases and desires for validation. Initiates of advanced spiritual knowledge were not exposed to such ideas until they had undergone deep psychological purification, developed mental stability, and demonstrated mastery over their own mind. Without this groundwork, exposure to existential spiritual truths can lead to existential terror, psychosis, or delusional belief. Simply listening to spiritual teachings does not equate to understanding them, and those who attempt to force profound realizations onto themselves or others often end up distorting the message entirely. The foundational truth of spirituality is that consciousness is fundamental, and the experienced reality is a product of an infinite mind, a dream of sorts. A person's perception of reality is not objective, but filtered through their mind's mechanisms. If their mind is primarily subconscious, conditioned, and reactionary, they are unaware of how their own thoughts and emotions shape their experience. Being exposed to spiritual truths without first mastering one's own mind can lead to complete misunderstanding or even psychological harm. The modern spiritual crisis: healing versus belief attachment. Most people do not enter spirituality through truth-seeking. They enter it searching for healing, purpose, or meaning because they are in pain, lost, or disillusioned. Rather than using spirituality to transcend their mind, they use it to reinforce their existing mental structures, attaching to new beliefs, identities, and ideological battles rather than dismantling them. This is why modern spirituality is filled with individuals clinging to conspiratorial thinking, manifestation culture, and spiritual bypassing, mistaking these distractions for genuine awakening. Real awakening does not reinforce identity, it dissolves it. However, many people turn spirituality into another ideological safety net rather than a means of deep transformation. This is why advanced spirituality can be dangerous for an unprepared mind. A person still carrying emotional wounds and unresolved trauma will only experience existential truths as either profound terror or a fragile new belief to defend at all costs. Historically, mysticism was reserved for those who had already undergone self-refinement. The mystery schools weren't gatekeeping knowledge out of greed or elitism. They were safeguarding people from themselves. In contrast, the modern world has completely broken this structure. People are thrown into psychedelic awakenings before they've done any groundwork, latch onto spiritual ideas without deconstructing their own biases, and mistake intellectual concepts for direct experience. Worse, they become militant about their newfound beliefs, failing to realize they've merely swapped one illusion for another. The path forward: from psychological stability to true awakening. Rather than exposing unprepared individuals to higher spiritual truths, I shifted my focus to foundational mental and emotional work. Before anyone can truly awaken, they first need psychological stability. They must recognize how their mind was shaped, identify their emotional reactions, and understand that they are trapped in a self-created feedback loop. A structured approach to awakening can look as follows. Compassionate inquiry, tracing trauma and emotional conditioning back to their origins. Mental deconstruction, understanding how the mind constructs reality and identifying conditioned patterns. Dissolving and reprogramming, breaking automatic responses and self-imposed limitations. Creation and expansion, learning to consciously work with awareness rather than being blown like a leaf in the wind. Complete awakening, dissolving all attachment and becoming lucid within the dream of existence. Each step builds upon the last. Skipping steps leads to delusion. Most people want enlightenment without self-inquiry, awakening without psychological stability, and ego death without understanding what the ego even is. But awakening isn't something you believe in. It happens when belief itself dissolves. The American Great Awakening is not spiritual awakening. What is happening in America and the broader global conspiratorial movement is not a great awakening. It is a collective distraction. A true awakening is the turning inward of awareness to awaken from the dream of narratives and illusions. The so-called American Great Awakening is the opposite. It is an obsession with external enemies, fabricated stories, and ideological warfare. If you find yourself caught in this movement, it's not too late to step back and question. What drew me to spirituality in the first place? Was I looking for healing and understanding, or did I get lost in narratives? Have I been distracted by conspiracies and external enemies instead of facing myself? Am I truly seeking truth? Or am I just looking for something new to believe in to justify how I already am? You don't need to be healing forever. You don't need to form an identity around spirituality. Spirituality was never meant to be a belief system. It was always meant to be about direct experience and awareness. If you came to spirituality because you were suffering, go back to the original moment, before you got caught in conspiracies, past lives, crystals, spells, aliens, and endless mental distractions. What were you really looking for? That's where you need to return. That's where the real path begins. If you are still fighting, demonizing, and labeling others as evil, you are not awakened. You are trapped in duality. Are we lost in this current situation? If more people operated from genuine awareness rather than reactionary belief systems, our entire social and spiritual landscape would look radically different. We wouldn't see power structures built on fear, division, and ignorance. We would cultivate systems that enhance consciousness, self-awareness, and authentic exploration of reality. However, right now we are witnessing the last desperate gasps of fear-based control systems clinging to existence. Those who see the larger pattern often feel isolated, disconnected, or frustrated by the world around them. It's like being lucid in a dream while everyone else remains convinced the illusion is real. The worst part, many of those still trapped in their conditioned mind structures believe that they are the ones who are awake. But there is hope. The fact that I can see and name these patterns means that the shift is already in progress. Human consciousness is evolving. The backlash is strong, but it only happens because the shift is working. The old world wouldn't be screaming so loudly if it weren't losing its grip. A true great awakening does not involve external battles. It is the quiet, profound realization that everything, including the illusion itself, is part of the same consciousness. The way forward is not found in more stories, but in transcending the need for stories altogether. When belief falls away, awareness remains.